I'm a park ranger out in Nevada. There was an old abandoned mining town that sat a ways off the main road. The Park Service had claimed it a while back, but people were not encouraged to visit there. In fact, it was plainly marked with signs that said, "Off limits," "No trespassing," "Danger." Hell, about the only thing they didn't do was build a moat around the place. Sometimes I wonder if they should. Some people need to learn to read or listen, one of the two, because it seemed like I was always chasing people out of there. They'd look at me like I was crazy, but every one of them would spray gravel as they hauled ass after I'd tell them the story. I'm not supposed to tell the story. I've been warned many times, even threatened with much worse than the unemployment line. I guess maybe I need to learn how to listen too. But it was the best way to make sure people left and never came back. I'm tired of being told to keep my mouth shut. I'm tired that nothing's been done about it. We rangers are supposed to just go about our jobs and pretend it never happened. Well, I believe that's the best and quickest way for it to happen again. And I never want it to happen again. It was a while ago. That's my way of saying I forget how long ago it was, but the memory's still fresh enough to tell. It was back when even I was unsure why the town was off limits. I'd heard old wives' tales and urban legends, but no one would ever commit to anything concrete. I asked around once and was told that I was better off not knowing. The old rangers would just tell me to mind my business and stay out of town. But something about it always intrigued me. I was never good at blindly following orders, so as often as I could, I'd find some excuse to drive past it. On that day, it was a good thing I did, or a bad thing depending on how you look at it. I noticed a small mobile home parked at the edge of the town. I knew it hadn't been there the day before. I pulled up behind it and got out of my truck. I scanned the area around and didn't see anything moving that the wind wasn't blowing. I walked around the vehicle and it seemed to be in good shape. None of the tires were flat. There seemed to be no good reason for them sitting there unless they were sightseeing. I peeked in the windshield but couldn't see anyone, so I went to the side door and knocked. "Park ranger," I said. "Anybody in there?" The wind whistling was my only answer. I knocked again. "Park ranger, is everyone all right?" No answer. I pulled on the door latch and it opened. "I'm coming in," I said. "Just need to check to make sure everyone's okay." I pulled the door open and stepped inside. Unconsciously, I rested my hand on my sidearm. I closed the door behind me, leaving the wind outside. I looked around the camper and found plenty of food and supplies. They seemed to be well stocked for a trip. I stepped back toward the bedroom, keeping an ear open for anything. It was eerily silent. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my boots on the linoleum as I headed back the short hallway. It wasn't a long walk until I got there. The bedroom was clean and the bed had been made. I opened a few drawers and found clothes for a man and a woman. There was no sign of a struggle, so I went back out to the kitchen, stopping to open the bathroom door and find 2 kids' toothbrushes and toothpaste sitting on the sink. Just like the bedroom, everything seemed to be in its place. I noticed the hand towel holder was empty. I looked on the floor to see if it had fallen, but the towel was just gone. I shrugged it off and went back out to the kitchen. The table was still folded down into a bed, as these smaller models were known for. Scanning around, I was hard-pressed to find anything out of the ordinary, except for the fact that no one was there. I stepped outside and the sun had disappeared. It would be dark soon. I looked around but didn't see anyone. It was as if they parked the camper at the edge of town and went for a walk. I stepped out of the camper and turned to close the door. That was when I saw it. There was a small dot of red on the step. I leaned closer and it looked like it could be dried blood. I tried to dismiss it as nothing. People drip blood every day for simple, non-threatening reasons. Nosebleeds, small cuts, general accidents. It could be absolutely nothing. But when you add in a missing family at the edge of an abandoned town that's supposed to be off limits, normal things don't look so normal. I didn't touch it in case it needed to be tested later for a DNA sample. And there it was. I was already starting to look at this as a crime scene. I looked down at the ground and saw my boot prints in the dirt, leading up to the camper. I also saw other tracks. There was another set of adult boot prints, a set of adult sneakers, and 2 different sets of smaller sneakers. Those were spooky but comforting. At least I knew these people were here somewhere. They hadn't just vanished from inside the camper. No, it was the other footprints that gave me chills. They were adult-sized and it looked like there was more than one of them, but the creepy thing about them was they were bare feet. I couldn't imagine anyone who lived in the area being stupid enough to walk around the desert in their bare feet. Aside from the different types of scorpions, There were also snakes, spiders, and lizards, just to name a few. It was becoming more likely that I would find this family dead from stupidity. I followed the barefoot tracks and they seemed to lead around the corner of the camper. In fact, they did several laps around the camper, with frequent stops where the feet were pointed toward the camper as if looking inside. That's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. This family had been stalked. I stepped in a wider circle so I wouldn't disturb the footprints. It became more apparent by the minute that this was a crime scene. I pulled out my radio to call in my position and request backup or police, but my radio was strangely silent. It didn't even click when I released the talk button. The light was lit, so I knew the battery was charged, it just wasn't transmitting. The smart thing to do just then would have been to get in my truck and drive to the station to report what was happening. I took one step toward the truck. That's when I heard the scream. It was a woman's scream, high and piercing. It was a scream of pain and anguish, as if her whole world had come crashing down. My fight or flight kicked in and there wasn't an ounce of flight in it. In a heartbeat, my gun was in my hand. I turned toward the town and began following the footprints. Once they were done circling the camper, they headed straight into town. Dusk had faded and taken the light with it. I pulled my flashlight off my belt and used it to guide me on my trail. There were a half-dozen buildings, all in some level of decay. I was worried about stepping into one and it just collapsing on top of me. That aside from the chance of meeting a scorpion or some other creature that didn't appreciate being disturbed in their territory. The wind had died down and the air was still. It was so quiet, I could hear my own footsteps. There was something else too. I felt a vibration in the air. At the time, I thought it was just my heightened senses at the prospect of meeting up with a dangerous person who may have harmed that family. Even though everything within me was demanding I run towards the scream I'd heard, my steps were slow and measured. I needed more input. I needed to know how many people I was dealing with. I needed to identify threats, and if I would be able to deal with this without becoming a victim myself. As I approached the first building, I had a strong feeling of being watched. Stepping on the porch made the boards creak threateningly. I didn't want this to end with a broken ankle or worse. I tested the boards before putting full weight on them and slowly approached the broken windows. I shone my light inside. I panned around slowly, finding a bunch of old boxes and general junk with the odd wooden chair and table. I was about to move on when back in the far corner I saw a pair of eyes lit by my flashlight. I froze, my light locked on it. The eyes seemed to be locked on the light as well. I couldn't tell what it was, but it scared the hell out of me. I suddenly thought of the movie I'd recently seen, Jurassic Park, when the actor was explaining how raptors attack, how one will draw your attention while two more sneak up on you and attack from the side. I suddenly felt very vulnerable, as if someone was sneaking up behind me. I whipped around, pointing with my gun and flashlight, my eyes darting all around. But I couldn't see anything. I shone my light back inside, but the eyes were gone. This didn't comfort me. In fact, it did the opposite. I was in a panic. I felt like I was surrounded, and they were just toying with me. I didn't even know who they were. I took a few deep breaths to get myself under control. I knew panic led to bad decisions, and I couldn't afford any bad decisions out here on my own. I shone my light back toward the camper and saw a shadow dart out of the light. I knew it was all or nothing. There was no backing out. I was being hunted just like that family had been. I didn't know what was hunting me, but it didn't matter. Whoever or whatever, it was dangerous. Focus, I told myself. Stay on your toes, remember your training. Even though my training also said don't get yourself in a bad situation. It was already too late for that. Something was near the camper. I still had no idea if this family was dead or alive. The only things I had to go on were mysterious footprints and a scream. It was the stuff of every horror movie ever made. I just hoped I didn't end up as one of the victims that died a horrible, gory death to save some stupid teenagers who risked their own lives by blundering into something they should have left alone. I sighed, turned my light back to the ground, and followed the footprints. I noticed for the first time there were other marks among the footprints. They had been walked over and obscured, but it looked like two long lines like someone was being dragged. I brought my flashlight back up just in time to see a set of eyes disappear behind a building on the other side of the street. I stepped up to the next building and shone my light inside to find much the same as the first, minus the eyes. I didn't linger long before turning my light back out to the streets and the other buildings. I felt like it somehow kept them at bay. as if they would work their way closer to me if I didn't shine my light their way. I didn't know how long this would last. I continued to the next building, with a larger building looming larger at the end of the street. It looked like it was an old church. There was the rough shape of a steeple that had partially collapsed. I turned and flashed my light back to the street to keep the hunters back. When I stepped up to the window of the next building and shone my light inside, I found bones. Piles of bones. Most looked like they were from smaller animals, but there were larger ones interspersed with them. I was sure I spotted a couple of human femurs. I tried my radio again, but it still wasn't working. The vibration in the air was getting stronger. It was oppressive, like the pressure you feel when you're underwater. The stillness in the air magnified any sound. I could hear the footsteps of someone behind me, but when I turned, I couldn't see anyone. I left the bone storage building and headed for the last building at the end of the street, the church. I walked up to the doors and they were very plain. 2 wooden doors, no Gothic architecture, no cross. Just a couple of wooden doors that looked like they were about to fall off their hinges. I hesitated, turned and looked back down the street. I knew they were there but couldn't see them. This was where they'd been hurting me all along. I held my gun and flashlight at the ready, knowing I was in for a fight as soon as the doors opened. I took a deep, cleansing breath, then shoved the doors open. I shone my light all around, my eyes darting to all the dark corners. Except they weren't dark. There were candles lit all around. It was quite beautiful. It was also quite empty. There was no one there. Even empty and well lit, it gave off a creepy vibe. Why do empty churches always do that? You would think it would be the opposite. My senses went on high alert. I didn't trust it. It must be a trap. As I continued to scan back and forth, looking for any hiding spots among the pews, I noticed there was one person there. In the first pew, bent over so I could barely see them. I slowly made my way forward, head on a swivel as I approached the lone figure. When I was nearly there, it looked like they were barely breathing. I came around in front of the creature and aimed my gun. She looked up at me. She was naked and her hands and mouth were bound. As soon as she saw me, she started screaming into the gag in her mouth. She was screaming so hard her face turned red. I reached down and slid the gag off her mouth. "It's a trap!" she screamed. I looked up and saw my worst nightmare. There were creatures, dozens of them. Each one looked vaguely human, but they were deformed. There was one that had one healthy arm and a second that was shriveled up. One had only a single leg but still managed to hop toward me. Another had no legs but used its arms to crawl on the floor. None of them had a full set of teeth, but they all had a look of hunger and rage in their eyes. They came from everywhere. Some even crawled their way down from hiding places in the ceiling, like some horrific Spider-Man. They swarmed toward the front of the church. I looked around for anywhere to go, anywhere to hide, when I locked eyes on a door that looked like it was a closet. "Come on," I said, grabbing her arm and dragging her over to the door. "No, I can't. Please don't make me," she said, tugging against me. "We go in here or we die," I said, cutting the ropes around her wrists and putting my jacket over her shoulders. She reluctantly came along with me as the horde of creatures was nearly on us. "Quick," I said, opening the door and shoving her through. I slammed it shut behind me, taking out my knife and jamming it into the wooden door frame to keep it shut. I turned and nearly ran her over. She hadn't moved. She was standing there staring into the dark. I shone my flashlight in front of us and saw a rickety staircase descending into the darkness. Please don't make me go down there," she whimpered. "We don't have a choice," I said. "They'll be through this door soon." The pounding had gotten louder. She turned toward the door, then pulled my jacket closer around her and took a deep breath. I stepped around her and led the way, shining my light all around, trying to make sure we wouldn't run into any surprises. The boards creaked menacingly with every step I took. I couldn't see what was underneath, but had no desire to find out the fast way. I looked back and she was still staring down. I held my hand out and she slowly took one step, then another. Her bare feet were filthy. I wondered if she was getting splinters as she took each step slowly and gingerly as if walking on hot coals. After she had taken a few steps, I turned back to guide our way. The stairway was long and attached to an uneven stone wall. At some points it jutted out far enough I had to squeeze around to get to the next step. It was getting colder as we descended. I started missing my jacket but knew she needed it more. The spider webs weren't helping my anxiety either. I wondered if they were made by the deadly breed. I glanced back and saw she was still working her way down the stairs. When I looked forward again, there was a creature coming up the stairs toward me. I didn't think, just reacted. I barely had the gun pointed until I fired. The creature fell back with shock frozen on its face and tumbled down the stairs. I instantly regretted my action as my ears were already ringing from the gunshot in such an enclosed place. I turned around to check on her, but she was curled up in the fetal position, sitting on a step, ears covered, rocking back and forth. "It's okay," I tried to say, but my voice sounded strange. "I guess temporary deafness will do that. At least I hoped it was temporary." She didn't look at me. I was unsure if she had heard me, so I touched her shoulder and she immediately recoiled and climbed several stairs, backing away. I bent down to her. "Look, I know you're scared, I would be too. But if we're going to get out of this, we have to do it together. If I'm going to have to check on you every few steps, we'll be helpless if another one of those things attacks." "I don't want to go down there," she stammered. I looked ahead and then back at her. "We have no choice." I turned and started down the stairs again. After around a dozen steps, I turned to see she had stood and was slowly making her way down again. I kept going until I made it to the bottom and kicked the corpse of the creature out of our way. I looked around, but there wasn't much to see. It was a passageway made of the same rough-cut rock walls and a dirt floor. I turned to see her make it to the last step. Her eyes were wide with fear. I could only imagine what she had already been through. She looked away as she stepped past the corpse. I decided to make a little conversation as we walked down the endless passageway to get her to focus on something other than our situation. "You're from the camper, aren't you?" I said. She nodded absently as she stared at the floor. "Were you going on vacation?" Another nod. "I saw the kids' toothbrushes on the bathroom sink. How many kids do you have?" Her eyes glazed over. "2 boys." "And your husband is with you?" She nodded. "Where were you headed?" "Vegas." "What made you stop here?" "The kids wanted to see the abandoned town." Tears streamed down her dirty cheeks, making lines on her face. "Would you like me to stop talking?" She nodded. We continued forward in silence. The chill of the place made me shiver, but not just because of the temperature. The thought of being attacked at any moment was more than keeping me on my toes. It was wearing on my nerves. After some distance, we came to an opening that stretched out into a full room. She stopped and stared. I was puzzled at first until I noticed the smell. It was the stench of death. I shone my light around the room. The first corner I came to held a pile of bones. There was no denying these ones were human. They were large and the right shape. There were even a couple of full torsos still together that hadn't deteriorated yet. In the next corner, there were 3 bodies hanging from the dirt ceiling. It looked like a man and 2 boys. They had been strung up by their arms and were covered in blood. There were innumerable cuts and puncture wounds, but the most horrid sight were the many bites that were taken out of them. She collapsed and began to sob. I knew right away this was her family. "I'm so sorry," I said. She looked at me with a mix of hopelessness and rage. "I tried to tell you not to come down here," she said with quiet forcefulness. "I'm sure we can find some way to—" She shook her head violently. "You don't understand," she said, looking me straight in the eyes for the first time. "This is the trap." She stood up straight for the first time since I'd seen her in the church, took off my jacket and tossed it behind her. She was beautiful, even though she was covered in filth. "My children need food," she said, stretching out her arm. In an instant, 2 deformed creatures appeared and stood beside her. She stroked the thinning hair on their heads as they cooed at her. "So there was no woman in the camper?" I said, trying to stall for time until I could come up with a plan. "Oh no, there was a woman. She was taken to the birthing house. She will give my children their own children. Against her will, of course." She looked at me with disdain. "She is a tool we will use to survive, just like my ancestors were treated as tools to be used in the mines." I glanced around the room and saw several more creatures emerge from the shadows and advance slowly toward me. I knew I was trapped. My mind scrambled for some plan, any plan to escape the horrors that waited for me. I glanced at the 3 bloody, mangled bodies dangling from the ceiling and knew that would be my fate. I made my decision and didn't hesitate to implement it. In a flash, I drew my pistol and shot her in the forehead. The sound was still echoing when I started to run back to the passageway I had come from. I hoped that the shock of seeing their mother die would give me a head start before the horde of creatures hunted me down and tore me to shreds. Time seemed to move in slow motion. I felt like I was running underwater. Every move, every step seemed incredibly slow. I knew they would catch me. There was no doubt in my mind it was only a matter of time. The only thing that kept me from giving up was the sheer will to live. I swung the flashlight as I ran, making shadows jump and fly around. I arrived at the bottom of the stairs much sooner than I thought possible, and threw myself up them 2 at a time, praying that I didn't trip. The horde was hot on my heels. I could hear them getting closer. The grunts and snarls spurred me on even faster. I felt something brush against my heel and knew I had to act. I didn't bother to look back. I fired 2 shots into the closest one. I heard the inhuman scream and the sound of falling bodies. I risked a glance back to see them all tumbling down the stairs. I breathed a sigh of relief as I reached the door and struggled to pry my knife out of the wood. After a few agonizingly long seconds, it came free, and I dove through the door. Much to my surprise and relief, the church was empty. They must have all gone another way to trap me below. I looked over at the dozens of glowing candles and ran straight toward them, knocking over as many as I could. I ran to the far wall and did the same on my way out the door. Once I was through, I turned back and jammed my knife into the doors so they wouldn't open. I didn't waste time celebrating my close escape. I ran down the middle of the street so I would have a good view of anyone or anything chasing me. It didn't take long until I heard footsteps behind. They sounded more like a pack of dogs chasing me. I glanced back and sure enough, there were a half-dozen deformed creatures in hot pursuit against the backdrop of the church engulfed in flame. I took some solace in the fact that at least some of the unnatural bastards must have burned up in the blaze. I had a stitch in my side and my leg muscles burned, but I didn't dare slow down. Even at the speed I was running, they were catching up. I wasn't sure if I would make it to the truck before they got me. It was going to be close. I reached the truck and breathed a sigh of relief that I hadn't locked it. By the time I got the keys in the ignition and started it, they were on me. I locked the doors and slammed it into reverse as the first body flew into my windshield, shattering it. I got some momentum going as another landed on my hood and another grabbed my door handle. I swung the truck around and slammed on the brakes, sending them flying. I threw it in drive and stomped on the gas, spraying gravel. I hadn't gone more than a few yards when another freak landed in the truck bed and started pounding on the cab roof. I could see the dents getting deeper. It would be through soon. Suddenly the pounding stopped. I kept my eye on the road but turned to see what was happening. It smashed through my rear window, grabbing me by the neck. I swerved to try to break its grip to no avail. I could feel myself starting to black out. I knew that would be a death sentence. I pointed my gun out the window, but the creature grabbed it before I could aim at its head. My mind raced faster than the truck that was hurtling down the dirt road at breakneck speeds. I was seeing stars. I knew it was a matter of minutes until the end, if not seconds. I squeezed the trigger. The gun went off right beside its head, missing it by a few inches. I was done. It howled in pain and fear at the sound and the heat of the round going off. Amazingly, it let go of the gun. I aimed at its head and squeezed the trigger again. Blood rained on me as its head snapped back and it fell into the bed of the truck with a heavy thump. I set the gun on the seat beside me as I breathed huge gulps of air, wiping the blood out of my eyes. My vision returned just in time for the turn onto the main road. The tires screeched as they bit into the asphalt on the way to the ranger station. I got there shortly after sunrise, pulled into a parking space and sat back in the seat. Exhaustion and adrenaline crash sapped my energy. I fell asleep. I woke to the sound of someone knocking on my window. I whipped around, grabbed the gun off the seat and swung it back around at the window. "Whoa there, son," the older ranger said, raising his hands. "What's got your panties in a bunch?" I took a deep breath, lowered the gun in the window, then told him the whole story. The longer I went, the more serious he became. Until the story was done, his face was made of granite. He stuck his hand in the window. "Keys," he said. I pulled the keys out of the ignition and handed them to him. "Go inside and get yourself cleaned up," he said. "I'll take care of this." I stepped out of the truck on shaky legs and walked into the ranger station, threw away my bloody uniform and took a long shower. By the time I had finished and changed into a fresh uniform, the other ranger was back. He stepped inside the station and scanned the room until he found me. "All taken care of," he said with a crooked smile. "What do you mean?" I said. "Did you call the police?" He looked around at the handful of rangers that were milling around the room, trying to make it look like they weren't listening to our conversation. Yeah, we're not going to get the police involved in this, he said. What? Why not? He looked at me with an odd determination in his eyes. So you really killed her, did you? He said. Of course it was her or me. Most of the folks around here give that place a wide berth, he said. There's signs all over saying no trespassing and danger. You'd think it was almost natural selection for those who ignore all the warnings. But those travelers. And then there are others who visit the place on the down low, all quiet like, he said as if I hadn't said anything. Those folks might say you robbed them of their fun. You might even call them conjugal visits. There might even be some of those folks in this very room. I stared at him in disbelief, then looked around the room and saw every set of eyes focused on me. There wasn't a smile or even a hint of one that suggested this was a joke. He clapped his hand on my shoulder. Why don't you head home and rest today? He said. You've had a long night, we'll take care of things. He ushered me toward the door, pausing before opening it. Just remember that nothing happened, he said. Because if the police get an anonymous phone call, we might have to drive out and grab a couple of children to come visit your house in the middle of the night. You get me? I nodded my head in a daze as he opened the door. That's the story I tell when people don't take the hint and stay away from the town. It's been years, and every once in a while I hear of travelers that disappeared in the area. I shake my head and wonder.
I'd been a park ranger for nearly 4 years. The other rangers always had some story to tell about their encounters with some monstrous creatures lurking in the dark. You'd have thought we were living in some fantasy novel with the creatures they described. The stories were amusing, but that's all they were to me, until they were suddenly something more. One evening, just as the sun had set, I was heading back to the station after a long day. The crickets were just starting their symphony, and the headlights of my old pickup were the only things tearing through the dark. That's when I saw it, right there on the edge of the dirt road. Something massive, crouched on 2 legs. The initial thought that rushed into my mind was, bear. It was the only logical explanation. But as my truck crawled closer and the headlights bathed the area in a harsh light, it was clear as day that this wasn't a bear. It was tall and lean and covered in pitch-black fur, more humanoid than animal. Its limbs were long and sinewy, unlike the thick, muscular legs of a bear. It was not on all fours as a bear might have been. Instead, it sat as a man would, casually observing the surroundings. Legends, I muttered to myself, remembering the stories my colleagues would tell. Had I just become part of one of those tales? The whole scenario felt surreal, like a dream you couldn't wake up from, no matter how hard you tried. The dark figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just sat there, a haunting silhouette under the stars. In my years as a park ranger, I'd learned that the wilderness had its own language. It spoke through the rustling of leaves, the chirping of insects, the gentle gurgling of a stream. But this was something entirely different. This was a language that I'd never heard before, a language of fear, uncertainty, and raw primal power. It was in that moment I realized that the legends I'd been hearing all these years weren't just stories to amuse or scare. They were warnings, whispers of something strange and primal that walked our lands, something we didn't understand and couldn't control. From that night on, my perception of the park changed, as did my perception of the stories shared around the station. My reality had shifted. The lines between fiction and fact were blurred. And as I stared into the eyes of the unknown, a peculiar blend of fear and fascination seized me. I knew then that my job as a park ranger was more than just patrolling and preservation. It was about acknowledging, respecting, and coexisting with the mysteries that our wild, untamed world still held. Just then, something remarkable happened. The creature, the thing, whatever it was, suddenly stood up. A breath caught in my throat as I watched it stretch, reaching a height taller than any man I'd ever seen. Its silhouette stretched long against the backdrop of the dense forest, seemingly merging with the night. I tensed in my seat, every instinct screaming at me to flee. But like a deer caught in the headlights, I remained frozen, my eyes locked on the figure. I realized I was holding my breath and forced myself to exhale, my breath fogging up the windshield. Slowly, with a grace that belied its size, the creature turned and began to move away, melting into the underbrush as if it was part of the forest itself. It didn't hurry. It didn't even glance back. It just disappeared, as silently as it had appeared. For a moment I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. I glanced around, half expecting to see the creature re-emerge from the shadows, but the road was empty, the only sound being the distant hooting of an owl and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I released my grip on the steering wheel and let out a shaky breath. My pulse was still racing and my mind was reeling, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The tall tales I'd always dismissed, they had become my reality. I'd seen something out there, something that couldn't be explained away, something that had forever changed the way I saw the park and my role in it. As I drove back to the station, the image of the creature, tall and regal, forever imprinted in my mind, I felt a strange sense of humility wash over me. I was a small part of something much larger, much wilder, and much more mysterious than I had ever imagined. From that day forward, my tales joined those of the other rangers, and with every telling I'd feel a shiver of fear, a thrill of respect, and a hint of wonder. For I'd seen the legends with my own eyes, and they were more magnificent and terrifying than any story could ever convey. However, this was not an isolated incident, far from it. In the weeks that followed, whispers of similar sightings began to trickle in from around the park. Hikers reported glimpses of a large black figure moving with an eerie grace through the wilderness. Campers woke up to find their sights disturbed, long footprints embedded deep in the soft soil. The stories varied in details, but were all marked by an underlying sense of wonder and unease. The creature was always described as tall, slender, covered in dark fur with long, spindly limbs. Its presence was always marked by an unusual calm, a palpable sense of being watched, observed. I couldn't help but feel a strange connection to these tales. They echoed my own encounter with the creature, brought back the emotions I'd felt that night. The terror, the fascination, the inexplicable sense of being part of something bigger, more profound. But as the stories piled up, so did my questions. What was this creature? Why was it appearing more frequently? Was it a warning or was it simply curious? I found myself spending more time out in the park, patrolling the trails, scanning the shadows, hoping for another glimpse of the creature. The wilderness had taken on a new layer of mystery, a new sense of anticipation that kept me on edge. And yet, with each passing day, my fear was gradually replaced with a strange sense of kinship. The creature, whatever it was, seemed more of a guardian than a threat. It was as much a part of the park as the towering trees and the rustling wind, as the chirping crickets and the gurgling streams. This newfound understanding didn't lessen the awe or the respect I had for the creature. If anything, it heightened it. It reminded me of the grandeur of nature, of the unknown entities that shared our world, living just out of sight, reminding us of the wildness we often forget in our manicured lives. One thing's for certain, every night as I drive my pickup down that dirt road, I keep my eyes open and the headlights bright. And every time a large shadow crosses my path, I hold my breath, waiting for a long, spindly limb to emerge from the darkness and a new tale to unfold. Just when I thought I'd experienced my fair share of encounters for the time being, my coworker Brian asked if I would help him clear some brush. Now Brian was an old hand at the ranger station, a grizzled veteran who'd seen it all. Well, almost. His eyes would glaze over whenever we shared our tales around the campfire, but I never caught him contributing to the narratives, not about the creature. "Got a small grove near the West Trail," Brian said one morning, his voice gravelly as always. "Storm took down some trees, needs cleaning up." I agreed, of course. A change of pace was welcome. Besides, working with Brian was always a learning experience. His knowledge of the park, the plants, and animals was encyclopedic. We set off early, the morning air still crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine lingering in the atmosphere. Our axes and chainsaws lay in the bed of Brian's old truck, bouncing with every rut and bump on the dirt road. As we neared the grove, a peculiar sense of familiarity washed over me. I recognized the surroundings, the oddly shaped boulder, the fallen log half submerged in a brook. This was near where I'd first seen the creature. A chill ran down my spine. We got to work, the whirring of chainsaws and the rhythmic thudding of axes echoing through the quiet forest. There was a comforting monotony to the task, a sort of rhythm that lulled you into a state of focused tranquility. Just as we were finishing up, a noise froze me in my tracks, a rustling, far too loud to be a squirrel or a bird. It was that distinct sound of something large moving through the underbrush. I turned to Brian, his eyes wide, his body stiff. He'd heard it too. For a moment we stood there in silence, our breaths hitching in the cool forest air as the rustling grew louder. Then, just as abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We were no longer alone. Something was watching us, observing us. I knew it. Brian knew it. For a moment, we just stood there, our gazes fixed on the dense foliage, the tools forgotten at our feet. Then, with a grunt, Brian bent down, picked up his chainsaw, and went back to work, leaving me standing there, a sense of awe washing over me. That day, Brian didn't share a story around the campfire. He didn't need to. His silence spoke louder than any words could. And in that silence, I knew we shared a connection, an understanding. We all did.
I'd been keeping watch over the landscape as a seasonal park ranger in Joshua Tree National Park. My job mostly involved overseeing the Jumbo Rocks campground, a relatively quiet region, especially once the desert's chill set in. On this particular night, I was returning home, which was situated at the other end of the park, a drive I had taken countless times before. Usually this journey would be under a veil of darkness with only the distant stars offering their muted glow. But this time a generous moon bathed the park in its cold, luminescent light, making the eerie desert landscape quite discernible. Driving down Park Boulevard, the road that takes you north through the park, my eyes caught a movement near some Joshua trees by an old fire pit that had long been abandoned. My initial thought, a coyote or maybe a desert fox. They were common in these parts. However, as my eyes adjusted to the peculiar shape, I realized this was no ordinary creature. It was standing upright, a feature distinctly human yet startlingly out of place. The entity was towering, an easy 7 foot tall at least, draped in what seemed to be lengthy, flowing dark hair, encompassing its entire form save for its face. Its face, bathed in the moonlight, held a strangely human characteristic, although it was hard to discern with absolute certainty from my angle and given the flickering moonlight. Its arms were peculiarly slender for such a sizable creature, long, thin, and ending with bony fingers that appeared elongated. I caught sight of it for about 10 seconds as my Jeep crawled on, but that fleeting encounter was enough to sow a seed of unease in my gut. I was left questioning my sanity, my perception, and my very understanding of the natural world. What exactly had I witnessed? Once home, my wife was the first person I shared my encounter with. Initially, as expected, she was skeptical, but as I elaborated on what I had seen, she grew thoughtful. She didn't mention terms like chupacabra or mothman. She wasn't one for cryptids or conspiracy theories. Yet she conceded that what I described could indeed be something unexplainable, perhaps even paranormal. For a long while, I struggled to accept this interpretation. Then, a few weeks later, something happened that shook me even further. It was another late night, just like the one before. I was finishing up a routine patrol, the desert cold biting through my parka. The familiar drive back home was in progress, the full moon once again casting long, stretching shadows on the landscape. I was on high alert, half expecting to see that strange figure again, when something else entirely occurred. Right on the edge of the Barker Dam, I spotted a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. This time I knew it wasn't the same creature I'd seen. This figure was smaller, more humanoid, and its movements were more deliberate. As I slowed down my vehicle, I could make out more details. It was a woman, thin, tall, and wrapped in layers of torn, dirty clothing. Her hair was matted, the color indistinguishable in the moonlight, but it was her eyes that caught my attention. Wide, full of fear and desperation, they stared at me unblinkingly from a face smeared with dirt and what seemed like dried blood. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped out of my vehicle, keeping my gaze fixed on her. But as soon as I approached, she vanished, almost as if she was swallowed by the shadows. I stood there, in the middle of the road, feeling the icy wind whip around me as the unsettling echo of her presence lingered in the air. The very next night, as the desert once again succumbed to the silvery shroud of moonlight, I saw her again. It was during my usual patrol round, the familiarity of my daily routine now tainted with an edge of apprehension and anticipation. The Barker Dam, the very place I had spotted her last, loomed ahead in the dim light. As if guided by an unseen force, my eyes strayed towards the same spot. There she was, standing as she had been the night before. The woman, thin and tall, her dirty, ragged clothing billowing slightly in the night wind. She seemed to be waiting, her wide, fearful eyes fixed on my approaching vehicle. I stopped the vehicle at a distance this time, taking a moment to gather my thoughts. I wasn't prepared for another vanishing act. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the vehicle and began to approach her cautiously. Yet as I neared, she didn't disappear into the darkness. She just stood there watching me. I tried to communicate, to ask who she was, what she was doing out here in the middle of the night, but she only responded with silence. Her lips moved as if she was trying to form words, but no sound came. Her gaze, full of inexplicable sadness, bore into me. Upon returning home, I shared the encounter with my wife. The fear in her eyes mirrored my own, yet she was adamant about me going back, helping this woman. Maybe she's in trouble, she suggested. Maybe she needs us. That night, sleep was elusive. Images of the woman under the moonlight haunted my thoughts. The park, my workplace, had turned into a cryptic enigma, revealing secrets that I wasn't sure I wanted to uncover. But one thing was certain. I couldn't ignore the woman. The following day, I'd set out with the resolve to help her, to get to the bottom of the mysteries unfolding in Joshua Tree National Park. The following day, I was back at Barker Dam, this time just as dusk fell. It was earlier than my usual rounds, but the anticipation was gnawing at me. I was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery woman's appearance. Perhaps she was lost, or in danger, or perhaps she was connected to the strange creature I had seen weeks prior. As I drove up the familiar path, I saw her again. Just as before, she was standing near the dam, her thin form almost blending into the shadows. This time, however, she wasn't alone. A smaller figure, presumably a child, clung to her side. My heart raced as I stepped out of the vehicle. I called out to them, my voice echoing in the desolate landscape. Much like the previous night, she didn't reply. But she didn't disappear either. She seemed to understand me but couldn't, or perhaps wouldn't, communicate verbally. Her eyes told a story, one of fear, desperation, and a plea for help. The child next to her mirrored her silence, looking at me with wide, curious eyes, clinging tightly to her hand. The following weeks turned into a pattern of silent meetings. I would bring food and water, leaving them at a distance for her and the child. I contacted the local authorities, but they found no missing persons reports that matched their descriptions. My wife, as supportive as ever, suggested we get in touch with an anthropologist friend of hers who had experience with indigenous tribes. The woman and the child, she suggested, might belong to a hidden community that had somehow stayed under the radar. The anthropologist was intrigued and agreed to help. Over the next few weeks, we tried to communicate with the woman, to understand her story. Yet, she remained as enigmatic as the park itself, an entity coexisting in our world but never truly a part of it. Despite the unanswered questions and the mystery, there was a strange comfort in these encounters. They were a reminder that the park held secrets, stories that perhaps were not meant to be unveiled. Yet we were a part of that story now, and so we continued day after day, ensuring the woman and the child were safe, while respecting the unspoken boundaries they had set. And as for the creature I had initially encountered, it never appeared again. Well, I should say it has not yet appeared again. Yet the woman and the child were a constant, their silent presence an enduring mystery in the vast, whispering expanse of Joshua Tree National Park.
As a park ranger, I've seen many things I've been forbidden to share, but I can't take it any longer. Today, I break the chains that bind me, for there's a tale that must be told. A tale that shatters the tranquil facade of the natural world and sends shockwaves through the very essence of our existence. Gather close, dear listeners, as I unleash the forbidden whispers that have haunted me for far too long. A few years ago, I was working a routine shift on a moonless night. The air was thick with an eerie stillness. I found myself deep in the heart of the forest, miles away from any signs of civilization. The darkness closed in around me, as if the trees themselves were conspiring against my presence. Yet I pressed on, determined to complete my rounds. Around midnight, I reached an isolated clearing. The surrounding trees stood tall and imposing, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the flickering beam of my flashlight. It was here that I first felt an inexplicable sense of dread creeping up my spine. The woods had turned eerily silent, devoid of even the faintest rustle of leaves. As I continued my patrol, an unsettling sensation washed over me. It felt as if unseen eyes were watching my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trespassing in a domain not meant for human presence. Every step I took echoed with a weighty solemnity, intensifying the sense of foreboding that gripped me. Suddenly, a rustling sound emanated from the underbrush nearby. My heart skipped a beat and I strained my ears to catch any further movement. The stillness returned, leaving me on edge. I dismissed it as an animal scurrying away, hoping to calm my racing thoughts. But then a low, guttural growl reverberated through the darkness. It sent shivers down my spine, freezing me in place. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if some unseen creature lurked in the shadows, taunting me. Fear gripped me like a vice, but I knew I had to continue my patrol. I couldn't let my imagination run wild. Yet the more I tried to rationalize the situation, the more the forest seemed to push back, whispering its own malevolent secrets. Time lost its meaning as I ventured deeper into the woods. The oppressive darkness threatened to consume me, and an unnatural chill seemed to seep into my bones. Every step forward became a struggle, as if an invisible force sought to keep me from discovering what lay hidden in this forbidden realm. Then, I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, like a distant whisper carried by the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent. It was a voice unlike anything I had ever heard, a chilling blend of agony and longing. I couldn't make out the words, but the anguish it conveyed sent shivers down my spine. Driven by curiosity mixed with an ever-growing dread, I followed the voice. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very ground conspired against me. The path twisted and turned, leading me deeper into an impenetrable darkness. Finally, I arrived at a small clearing, bathed in an ethereal glow. What I witnessed there defied all explanation. Shadows danced in a macabre ritual, swirling and merging into a grotesque figure. It stood before me, towering and otherworldly. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, piercing through the darkness and locking onto mine. I felt a force pulling at my soul, drawing me closer to this abomination. Panic coursed through my veins as I realized I had stumbled upon something beyond human comprehension. With every ounce of strength left, I tore myself away and stumbled back into the night, my mind filled with unspeakable terror. As I retreated from the clearing, my heart pounding in my chest, the grip of fear tightened around me like a vice. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been distorted in that accursed place. The air turned colder, biting into my skin like icy tendrils, and a thick fog rolled in, obscuring my vision. The forest, once familiar and welcoming, now felt like a labyrinth of malevolence. Every step I took was a struggle, as if an invisible force tugged at my feet, urging me to return to the horror I had just witnessed. The whispers that had haunted me earlier grew louder, echoing in my ears, tempting me to succumb to the unknown. But something deep within me fought against it, an instinctual survival instinct that refused to let me become entangled in whatever diabolical forces lurked in those woods. Time seemed to stretch and distort, as if the night itself had taken on a life of its own. Shadows danced and swirled, their movements mocking and taunting me. I dared not look back, fearing what I might see. Instead, I stumbled blindly through the underbrush, branches clawing at my clothes, as if the forest itself sought to keep its dark secrets hidden. My mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, fear, confusion, and a gnawing curiosity that pushed me to understand the nature of the unspeakable entity I had encountered. But even as my thoughts raced, an overwhelming sense of danger washed over me, urging me to flee. Deep down, I knew that to linger any longer in that accursed place would mean my doom. With each step, the force that had drawn me closer to that abomination seemed to weaken, as if it couldn't reach beyond a certain threshold. The fog gradually lifted and the temperature returned to normal, but my unease lingered, a nagging reminder of the horrors I had witnessed. The forest had changed, its serenity shattered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that its very essence had been tainted by an ancient and malevolent presence. Finally, I burst through the tree line, stumbling into the open, moonlit clearing. Gasping for breath, I collapsed onto the ground, my body shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. The distant sounds of nocturnal creatures seemed to mock me, their calls filled with an eerie resonance. I dared not look back, for I feared that if I did, I would see those glowing eyes once more, piercing through the darkness, forever etched in my memory. As I lay there, my mind slowly pieced together the fragments of what had occurred. The force that had pulled at my soul, drawing me closer to that abomination, had been an insidious temptation, a lure crafted to ensnare the unwary. It was an encounter that defied all logic, a glimpse into a realm beyond our comprehension, where the laws of nature ceased to exist. That night, I stumbled back into the safety of civilization, but the terror I had experienced would forever haunt my dreams. I've spent countless sleepless nights tormented by questions that have no answers. What was that abomination? What dark forces dwell within the depths of those woods? And how many others have unwittingly crossed paths with the unimaginable? If you venture into the depths of the wilderness, be cautious and trust your instincts. For there are things out there that defy explanation, lurking just beyond our perception, waiting for their moment to ensnare the unsuspecting. Remember my story, dear readers, and may it serve as a cautionary tale. Let the wilderness be a realm of wonder and awe, but never forget the unspeakable horrors that may lie hidden within its darkest corners. To this day, I bear the scars of that encounter, etched into my very being. I share this story not to frighten or entertain, but to warn others who might venture into the wilderness. There are forces lurking in the darkness, unseen and unimaginable, waiting to ensnare the unwary. Trust your instincts, for sometimes it is wiser to avoid the unknown than to face the unspeakable horrors that lie within. Stay safe out there, my friends, and may you never encounter what I faced in the heart of the wilderness.
I'm Sheila, and I am a park ranger in Yosemite. Over the years, my patrols have exposed me to numerous strange occurrences that defy rational explanation. Yet there's one unbelievable incident that has weighed on my soul, demanding to be shared. The burden of secrecy has become too heavy to bear, for it has come to a point where I can't go on living like this. It was a crisp autumn day, the air saturated with the rich scent of pine and the rustling of leaves beneath my boots. I had embarked on a routine patrol, meandering through the secluded woods that held their own secrets. The towering trees swayed in harmony, whispering ancient tales to those who would listen. As I walked deeper into the heart of the wilderness, a sense of anticipation coursed through me, as if nature herself held her breath, waiting for the unveiling of some hidden truth. Suddenly, a peculiar stillness fell upon the forest, as if time itself had paused. The usual chorus of chirping birds and scampering animals ceased abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence. My instincts heightened, and a shiver crept down my spine. Something was amiss, and I could feel it in my bones. As I continued my patrol, my eyes scanned the surroundings, searching for any signs of disturbance. That's when I noticed it. A subtle flicker of movement at the corner of my vision. I turned, catching sight of a shadowy figure darting between the trees. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I pursued the enigmatic presence, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure seemed to possess an ethereal grace, gliding effortlessly through the dense foliage. I pushed myself to the limits, determined to uncover the truth behind this mysterious apparition. Yet no matter how fast I ran or how desperately I called out, it always remained a tantalizing step ahead, like a mirage dancing just beyond my reach. Hours turned into an eternity as I chased the elusive figure, my determination eclipsing any thoughts of fatigue or self-preservation. Eventually, I found myself in a secluded clearing, bathed in the soft hues of the setting sun. The figure came to a halt, its form gradually solidifying before my bewildered eyes. Before me stood a creature unlike anything I had ever encountered. It possessed a radiant aura, as if the very essence of nature had woven itself into its being. Its eyes shimmered with wisdom and ancient knowledge, peering into the depths of my soul. I felt a profound connection, as if this creature held the answers to the mysteries that had plagued me for so long. As we stood in that sacred moment, a voice echoed in my mind, gentle yet commanding. It revealed to me the interconnectedness of all things, the invisible threads that bind us to the world around us. It spoke of the delicate balance between the seen and the unseen, the known and the unknowable. It was a revelation that shattered my understanding of the world, yet simultaneously filled me with an overwhelming sense of peace. But as quickly as it had appeared, the creature began to fade, its form dissipating like mist in the breeze. Before it vanished completely, a final message lingered in my mind. Share this truth with the world, for it is through understanding that we find harmony. Returning from that profound encounter, my mind swirled with conflicting emotions. I had witnessed something extraordinary, a truth that had the power to transform lives. Yet the weight of secrecy bore down on me, threatening to consume my every waking moment. I knew the risks involved in sharing my experience, the potential consequences for my career as a park ranger. But how could I turn my back on the profound message that had been entrusted to me? And so I find myself here, pouring my heart onto these pages, ready to break free from the chains of silence. The world deserves to know the wonders that lie within Yosemite, the hidden truths that have the power to unite us with the natural world. I can no longer keep this unbelievable incident to myself. For in sharing this story, I hope to ignite a spark of curiosity and inspire others to seek the mysteries that await them in the vast wilderness.
Imagine signing up as a park ranger, eager to protect the tranquil sanctuary of wildlife. But instead you find yourself fighting for survival as the creatures you vowed to safeguard transform into vicious predators. Nothing prepares you for the day when the peaceful hum of nature gives way to the roars of bloodthirsty beasts. It all started with the smaller animals. The birds pecked at each other viciously. Squirrels attacked rabbits without reason. Even the frogs in the pond seemed agitated, leaping at anything that moved. At first I chalked it up to the change in seasons or perhaps a shift in the local ecosystem. But then, the larger creatures began to change too. The deer, usually so gentle and timid, started to gang up on the wolves. I found carcasses torn and scattered, a horrifyingly reversal of the natural order. I remember one incident vividly. I was doing a routine patrol around the park when I heard an unnerving growl. A grizzly, its eyes filled with an unnatural rage, was bearing down on me. I've encountered bears before, but this was different. Its eyes were filled with pure malice. I barely managed to scramble up a nearby tree to escape, hearing its frustrated roars as it swiped at the trunk below me. I reported these strange behaviors to the higher-ups. They sent some scientists who took samples, observed the animals, and left without a word. It's been weeks now, but no answers have been forthcoming. One night, as I sat in the ranger station, I heard an eerie howl. It was no animal call I've ever heard before. I peered out the window, and what I saw haunts me to this day. Creatures of all kinds, wolves, deer, even birds, stood side by side, their eyes glowing with that same vicious hunger I had seen in the bear. They had become organized, acting with a singular purpose. Every night they would gather, their roars and cries echoing through the park, hunting together, bloodthirsty. I've since stopped doing night patrols, and I've urged the authorities to close the park. I'm documenting everything in hopes that someone will find a way to restore the natural order. I can only hope that we find a solution before the violent tendencies of the wildlife spread beyond the park borders. It's unsettling working in the park now. There's a constant sense of unease, a fear that I'm being watched, hunted. It's no longer the peaceful sanctuary it once was. The wildlife, they've tasted blood and there's no going back. I've since fortified the ranger station as best as I could, but the nights have become truly terrifying. Each nightfall is greeted with a chorus of otherworldly growls and cries, the animals moving in unison like a singular terrifying entity. One night, the animals attacked the station. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Deer and wolves, bears and cougars working together. They swarmed the building, clawing at the doors and windows. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't break in. Then, as quickly as it had started, the assault stopped. They retreated back into the darkness, leaving me to deal with the aftermath. The damage was extensive, but I was unharmed. That morning, as dawn broke, I ventured out, trying to assess the situation. The park was eerily quiet, as though the animals had disappeared. The silence was oppressive, even more terrifying than the violent chaos of the night before. I knew I had to get help. I managed to get a distress call out to the closest town, and they sent a group of armed men to help. But they couldn't believe what I told them about the animals. I don't blame them. I can barely believe it myself. Just as we were discussing our next steps, an unearthly roar echoed through the park. The men readied their weapons, but nothing could prepare us for what we saw next. The animals emerged from the trees, not as individual species, but as a monstrous, amorphous creature, like something out of a nightmare. I don't know how we survived that day, but I know one thing: the park is no longer safe. The wildlife have become something else, something sinister. I can only pray that whatever's causing this doesn't spread further. As for me, I've left my post as a ranger. I can't face the horror that my beloved park has become. I write this as a warning. Be careful when you venture into nature. For now, the natural world is not as it should be. It's filled with beasts, biding their time, waiting for the next prey to step into their territory. Just when I thought things might be calming down, a new horror unfolded. The armed men sent to help began exhibiting odd behaviors, mirroring the earlier changes in the wildlife. Their eyes, once filled with the determination to help, now gleamed with a savage hunger. Their words began to slur, their actions became erratic, and before long they started attacking each other. It was as if the same rage that had taken the animals was now inside them. I watched in utter shock from the safety of the ranger station. It wasn't just the animals anymore. The bloodthirstiness was spreading, transforming not just wildlife but humans too. I was now utterly alone, trapped in a park filled with creatures that were once my friends, my colleagues, and my sanctuary's residents. I immediately contacted the authorities, urging them not to send anyone else. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else falling victim to this horrifying transformation. I was now isolated in the park, surrounded by these terrifying beings. And then the power went out. That was the last straw. I could no longer stay in the ranger station. I packed essential supplies, navigational aids, and set out to leave the park. Navigating through the land, once familiar, now filled with an eerie dread, was horrifying. Every rustle in the trees sent chills down my spine. Every shadow seemed to hide monstrous forms. I walked on, every step a battle between my primal fear and the desperate need to escape. And then, as if to validate my worst fears, I noticed the birds. They were circling high above the park, their cries echoing off the silent trees. I watched as they flew away from the park, dispersing in all directions. The infection was no longer contained, it was spreading. With this realization, a new sense of urgency overcame me. I decided to head for the city, to warn them. The journey was long and fraught with danger. Every so often I'd hear the monstrous roars from the park, a chilling reminder of what I was running from. As I finally reached the outskirts of the city, I was met with an eerie sight. The city was quiet, too quiet. The bustle of traffic, the laughter of children, the hum of life, it was all missing. The silence was only broken by the soft rustling of leaves and the distant cawing of the birds. I pushed through the deserted streets, my heart heavy with fear. Had I arrived too late? Was the city already under the influence of the bloodthirstiness? My question was answered when I reached the city center. There in the square were the people, standing still as statues, their eyes vacant. But it was the birds perched on them, pecking away, that drove the horror home. The city had fallen. The affliction had spread. Now I'm on the move again. I don't know where to go or what to do. All I know is I need to survive and to keep trying to find help, to find someone, anyone who might be able to stop this, before there's no one left. Just then, out of nowhere, there was a burst of static from the old radio I had salvaged from the ranger station. It sputtered and spat before finally clearing into a weak but discernible signal. A voice, weary but determined, filled the silent city. If anyone can hear this, you're not alone. We have a safe haven at the old fort north of the city. The affliction doesn't seem to affect us there. Hope surged through me. I wasn't alone. There were others who had survived, others who might know what was happening, who could potentially help find a solution. With renewed vigor, I started moving north, away from the city and the eerie silence it held. The journey was harsh. I had to avoid the animals and the people afflicted, taking detours, hiding and running when necessary. After what felt like an eternity, the old fort came into view. It was fortified, well protected. Guards on the towers gave me a once-over before one of them shouted down, "You're human! Quickly, get inside!" I was ushered into a bustling hub of activity. People, real people, were walking around, talking, working. I was led to the command center where a group of people were hunched over maps and computers. And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. I was part of a group of survivors working to understand and combat this affliction. For the first time in what felt like ages, I felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps we could stop this. Perhaps we could save what's left of our world. With the combined efforts of the survivors at the fort, we began researching the affliction that had plagued our land. We were a mix of biologists, doctors, park rangers, and everyday folks who had managed to escape the spread of the affliction. I shared everything I had witnessed at the park and in the city, The team mulled over it, looking for patterns, for clues, anything that might help us understand and combat the affliction. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely we started making progress. We discovered that certain frequencies seemed to disrupt the aggressive behavior in the afflicted. We managed to develop a device that emitted these frequencies, effectively creating a protective barrier around our fort. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. We had found a way to protect ourselves, but our work was far from over. We needed to find a way to reverse the affliction, to bring back the ones we had lost to the bloodthirstiness. We're still fighting. Every day brings new challenges, new discoveries. There are days when the situation seems hopeless, when the affliction feels too vast, too overwhelming to conquer. But then I look around at the people by my side, at the survivors who have refused to give up, and I find the strength to carry on. We don't know if we can ever fully return to the world as it was before, but we're not giving up. We'll fight this affliction until we can walk freely in our world again, until our cities are filled with laughter and life, and until the wildlife in the park is just that, wildlife. I'm no longer just a park ranger. I'm a survivor. I write this as a beacon of hope to anyone out there who is still fighting, still surviving. You are not alone. We are here, and together we will reclaim our world.
Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to Eerie Escapes.